Well, I'll say good day, mates. My name is Sean from the Wellington Socialist Society. I'll just give a quick spiel about what our group's about. We host monthly talks on socialism and radical politics, and we're part of the wider New Zealand Federation of Socialist Societies, which has branches mostly in, well, Canterbury and Otago. There's sign-up sheets for our email list over there, I believe. And we also have copies of our journal, Commonweal, for sale for $5. So, talk to, well, actually, the exec want to put up their hands. Talk to one of those two if you're interested in a copy. Also, shout out our next talk on James Connolly, which will be 3rd of March, I believe, next month, and the two posters for that on the tables. Now, give a wee intro for tonight's speaker. Jesse Spafford is a philosophy lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington. He's a PhD from the City University of New York and is the author of Social Anarchism and the Rejection of Moral Tyranny, 2023, which is available free to download from Cambridge University Press, so check that one out. His website is www.jessespafford.com. And in tonight's talk, Jesse will defend the social anarchist rejection of property rights. Specifically, it takes Michael Huemer's influential libertarian argument against state authority and redirects it against private property, arguing that both states and private property owners lack adequate moral justifications for coercion they employ. In this way, the talk aims to provide a libertarian argument for socialism. And now I'll hand over to Jesse.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me here. Thank you everyone for coming. Like you said, I'm Jesse Spafford. I'm a lecturer in philosophy at Vic. And sort of as such, what I'll be doing today is I'll be giving you a philosophy talk. And what you standardly do in a philosophy talk is you present an argument. So that's what I'll be doing today. And specifically, I'll be walking you through an argument that I developed in a paper called Social Anarchism and the Rejection of Private Property. So I'll sort of be just running you through it, and then we can talk about it afterward. So the aims of this paper, there's really sort of two things that I'm trying to do with it. Unfortunately, there's a little HDMI logo there, but behind it, it says the aims of the paper. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to provide an interpretation of anarchism. This isn't to say that I want to give you the definitive statement of what anarchism is. I think there's lots of legitimate ways of understanding and interpreting anarchism. I'm going to give you a way of thinking about anarchism. Specifically, I want to present anarchism as a moral view. Which is to say, it's a view about how we should treat other people, what's right and wrong, what duties we owe to other people, what rights people have, that kind of thing. And then, specifically, what I want to argue or suggest is that we can understand anarchism as a moral position that starts with libertarian premises, but then uses them to arrive at socialist conclusions. So sort of a libertarian path to socialism. Right? Which is sort of surprising, because typically these are thought to be positions that are somewhat at odds with each other, right? Typically, socialists like things like state redistribution, promoting equality, etc., among many other things. And libertarians hate that, right? Libertarians generally think that the state is actually acting wrongly when it redistributes, when it taxes and transfers money from people and gives it to others. It thinks that when the state is doing that, it's wronging you, it's taking your property, right? So part of the sort of common libertarian position is they think the state is illegitimate. It's just a big gang of thugs. They take your possessions, which you have rights to, and give them to other people. They're stealing from you. Taxation is theft, and therefore it's wrong. So that's sort of a common libertarian view. Let me go back. What I want to do is I want to suggest that, well, actually, if we take seriously some of these libertarian premises, then their view is actually incoherent. And you should actually reject the kind of private property rights that libertarians favor. So that's one sort of aim. And in doing so, right, when I articulate anarchism in this way, what I'm also doing is I'm trying to give you an argument against libertarianism that can't be so easily dismissed by libertarians, right? So say you're arguing with a libertarian, and you say, well, look, the reason that the state should tax and transfer is because it promotes equality. Libertarians will often say something like, you know, I don't care about equality, right? Who cares? That's not part of their moral framework. But what I want to suggest is that actually, right, if I'm right and libertarian premises take you to socialist conclusions, that's much harder for libertarians to dismiss, right? It's like, yeah, by your own lights, as a libertarian, you should really be a socialist. Now, and there's sort of two ways you can go with that, right? On the one hand, this can just be sort of a nice little dialectical trick, right? You don't have to buy any of the libertarian point of view. You can just say, look, hey, your own view is incoherent. Bad luck, right? But alternatively, you might think, yeah, actually, I think libertarian premises lead to socialist conclusions, and maybe the libertarian premises are actually right. Maybe there's something attractive about those premises, in which case maybe you have some anarchist sympathies. So that's what I'm going to suggest, but hopefully this talk will be of interest to both people who have anarchist sympathies and people who just want to argue with their libertarian nemesis. Okay, so that's the aim of the paper. So to start off, right, what are these libertarian premises? What I want to suggest is that the core sort of a core libertarian commitment is one that's presented by Michael Huemer in his book, The Problem of Political Authority. Huemer's an anarcho-capitalist, he's sort of a radical right-wing libertarian. And what he argues is that states lack political authority, which is the right to coerce and the right to be obeyed. Right? So this will become clearer as we go through the talk, but basically he wants to say that there's nothing special about states. States are bound by the same moral rules that apply to all of us, and it turns out that those moral rules are pretty stringent. So the way that he argues for this is he starts off with a premise that coercion is something that needs to be justified. Right, where basically the idea is coercion is any kind of aggression against other people. It could include violent force, like just physically attacking somebody. It might be threatening somebody to get them to do what you want, something in that neighborhood. And his thought is that as a key part of common moral sense, moral common sense, is that coercion is generally thought to be wrong. And it's only justified if you have some kind of special justification. So he says, well, to illustrate this, imagine that you had a neighbor who starts to be pretty pushy. Right? So your neighbor one day comes over to your house and they say, hey, I've noticed that you're trying to put an extra story on your house. Well, I don't like how that looks. It's going to ruin the character of the neighborhood. You have to stop. And you say, well, no, I want to build my house. And they say, well, tell you what, if you keep building, I'm actually going to get my friends together. We're going to come in. We're going to throw you out. We're going to take your house. We're going to keep you from doing this. The thought is that kind of coercive action seems to be intuitively wrong. Like, it seems like your neighbors can't just treat you this way. Similarly, suppose your neighbor comes over and says, hey, I'm declaring that our neighborhood is now a dry neighborhood. There's no drinking of alcohol permitted. If I catch you drinking alcohol in your own house, I'm going to come and lock you in my basement. Again, intuitively, I think this seems impermissible, right? It seems like your neighbor will be treating you wrongly, and this is Huemer's view. And then finally, Huemer says, suppose your neighbor comes over and says, you know what, I've got this new project I'm working on. I'm building a new shed. I need money to fund it. You've got to pay me. Give me your money. And you say, no, and they say, well, sorry, if you don't give me your money, I'm going to, again, throw you in my basement. Right? In all these ways, it seems like your neighbor is trying to coerce you in ways that seem intuitively impermissible, so says Huemer. So he says, yeah, people can't just force each other to do things as a part of, that seems to be a moral common sense. But then he says, well, look, these things that your pushy neighbor is doing seems to be the kind of things that states do all the time, right? States do zoning regulations where they limit how tall you can build your house, and if you try to exceed that, they will, ultimately arrest you, maybe evict you, maybe seize your property. If states pass legislation that, say, outlaws marijuana, and if you try to smoke marijuana in your own home, theoretically you can be arrested for that. The state taxes you to take some of your money to fund various projects, some useful, maybe some not so useful. So the thought is, the state actually does things that we think are intuitively morally permissible when your neighbors do it, the state does it as well. But also most of the time people think this is fine, right? People generally don't bat an eye when the state does these same things. So what Huemer wants to suggest is, he says, look, it seems like people intuitively think that states have some kind of special right, a special right to coerce that ordinary people don't have. And that's what he calls political authority, right? It seems like people sort of assume states have this special moral power. But then the thought is, okay, if states have this moral power, what grounds it, right? Why are states special in this way? Because after all, the state is just a bunch of people. They gather together, they do things together, they're sort of like a big club. But it seems like there has to be then something that explains why it's permissible for them to coerce in ways that it wouldn't be permissible for your neighbor to coerce you. And what Huemer wants to do is he wants to argue that actually there's no actual justification that can be given for the state. So actually the state doesn't have this special right. People assume it does, but it doesn't. So I'll just run you through a couple of quick examples. So he says, here's one possibility that people often think. They often think that the state has a special right to coerce because it provides so many benefits to the citizens, right? By regulating traffic, by passing all these laws. Actually, you end up a lot better off than you would be if the state wasn't around to do this. And so the thought is, well, actually, maybe that's what justifies it coercing you. But Huemer thinks this doesn't work. Because he thinks, actually, it's not a good enough justification to coerce somebody just because coercion will leave them better off, right? So he gives a couple of thought experiments to try to show this, right? So suppose that you love eating potato chips. You eat a lot of them. It's actually bad for you to eat a lot of potato chips. So suppose that one day your friend says, you gotta stop eating these. And you say, okay, but I kind of like them. And your friend says, no, you have to. If you don't, I'm going to stab you in the arm. Right? And you might think, is your friend justified doing this? Like, they've got your best interest at heart, but it seems like, no, your friend can't just stab you in the arm to keep you from eating potato chips. Even though doing so would actually probably be in your best interest on the whole, or at the very least threatening you is in your best interest on the whole. So it seems like you can't just coerce people because it's in their best interest, right? Or suppose that you're having a disagreement, so he's got a case he calls the SNEAKU ad agency. So suppose you're working in an ad agency, all your coworkers have an idea for an ad, you actually know that there's a better option available. You say, let's do it my way. And all your coworkers, they disagree. And then you say, well, no, you know what? We're doing it my way. You pull out a gun, and you say, do it my way or else. Now in this case, right, you would actually be benefiting your coworkers. So assume that your way is in fact better. But it seems like, again, the fact that you're making people better off doesn't justify coercing them. So he thinks this justification is good. Alternatively, you might think, well, maybe the state coercion is justified because it is fair, right? There's all these public goods the state provides. It's unfair if some people fund them and other people don't. So it seems like maybe the state is justified in making everybody, say, support public infrastructure, bridges, lights, plumbing, etc. But again, Huemer doesn't think this works. So he says, imagine that one day your vigilante neighbor puts up a street light in the neighborhood, which is great. It makes the neighborhood look much better. It's safer at night. Everybody appreciates it. And then your neighbor comes over and you're like, oh, this is so nice. Thanks for doing that. And your neighbor says, oh yeah, no problem. By the way, now you owe me $50. And you say, what do you mean? And they say, oh, well, because I provided this. I built the street light. And you say, well, I didn't agree to this, right? I didn't sign on to this. And they say, yeah, but you're benefiting and everybody benefits. And it's only fair, so give me $50 or else I'll lock you in my basement. And again, it seems like that's not permissible. So it seems like, the fact, just because you're ensuring sort of a fair distribution, people fairly funding various projects, doesn't seem to justify coercion, Huemer thinks. Okay, one final possibility. Another reason people might think that the state has political authority, it's justified in coercing, is because the state is democratically supported, right? Everybody votes on this. And then the state sort of just does what the voters want. But again, you can run the same kind of thought experiment against this proposal, right? So again, suppose that your neighbor comes over and says, bad news, this is a dry town now, you're not allowed to drink alcohol in your house. And you say, well, no, you can't just tell me what to do in my own house. And they say, well, look, we voted on it. You and your next door neighbor said that people could still drink, but the rest of us all voted in favor of making this a dry town. So sorry, you can no longer drink. If you do, we'll lock you up. And again, it doesn't seem like this justifies your neighbor locking you up for drinking alcohol in your own home. So Huemer thinks. So the thought is that just because a majority of people voted for a particular thing doesn't mean that all of a sudden you can now coerce people into doing that thing. All right, so this is kind of Huemer's strategy. He has a whole book. He does this a bunch of different times. But hopefully you get the general idea, right? This is a general argumentative strategy, which is to consider various possible justifications for coercion, the state's coercion specifically, and argue that they don't work. And then he concludes, after he considers what he takes to be the best possible justifications, he thinks, yeah, I don't think any justification is going to work, so we should conclude at least presumptively that the state doesn't have political authority. It actually isn't justified when it coerces you. And so therefore, we should sort of reject the legitimacy of the state. Okay, so that's Huemer's argument very quickly. I think this is a sort of core libertarian position. I think lots of libertarians will like this. I think lots of anarchists will actually be attracted to this kind of argument. But what I want to argue is that if you take it seriously, then actually you should get that militates against the kind of private property rights that libertarians favor, including libertarians like Huemer. So that's what I want to do, is I want to try to take the same kind of argumentative strategy and run it against Huemer's, against private property. Okay, so what does this look like? Well, the first thing that I want to note is that actually, it seems like private property is a lot like political authority, right? So suppose you own private property, right? You've got some bit of land, you claim it as yours, and now you say, okay, I now have the rights to this. If you want to come on this bit of land, you need my permission. And specifically, it seems like you say, well, look, you need my permission to come on this land, and if you don't have my permission, right, then that's trespassing. And what happens to trespassers? Well, it's breaking and entering, it's trespassing, they're arrested, right? Similarly with using any sort of property, right? Like, look, this is my thing. If you use my car without my permission, well, now you get locked up. But what I want to suggest is, well, that's the same kind of coercion that we see the state using, right? When private property owners enforce their private property rights, ultimately what they're doing is they are coercing other people, right? They're saying, if you use this thing, this bit of land, this car, this house, etc., this beach, I will use violent force against you to keep you from doing that. But intuitively, I want to say that that kind of coercive control over physical spaces seems, in sort of common sense intuition, to be impermissible. So here's a case. I call it the island case. Imagine that you're riding a cruise ship around with a bunch of people, and one day you come upon a deserted island, previously undiscovered, somewhere in the Pacific. Nobody lives there. Everybody on the cruise ship is excited, like, oh, this is so cool, let's go explore the island. But one of the pushy people on the boat runs forward, leaps on the island, and says, no, I'm claiming this island as mine, I now own it, you all have to stay off of it. But I'll tell you what, you can come on if you pay me $50 and take off your shoes. Now you might think, what are you can imagine people on the cruise ship would be disgruntled, they'd say, what are you talking about, that I can't come on this island, we all want to explore. So, then suppose that somebody goes on the island and just says, I'm not going to pay you $50 to use this island. We all, it was just here in common. We all, we're going to use it. And they step on the island. And then the person says, nope, sorry, I'm not going to let you do that. And then they call up their gang of goons, and their friends sort of all tie this person up and lock them in the cruise ship. Right? Again, in this case, I think that seems impermissible. I think that would be probably the common sense intuition. Is, yeah, you can't just tie people up to keep them from using this thing you just found. But in some sense, right, I think that's what private property owners do all the time, right? If you own property, you're sort of doing the same thing. You're like, oh, I found this thing, finders keepers, it's mine now, use it, and I'll lock you up. So the thought is that if private property is justified, right, which many people think it is intuitively, that means there must be something special, right? Private property owners must have some kind of special right. Right, just as the state, many people think the state has a special right to rule, you might think that private property owners have a special right to coercively control resources. But then what I wanted to say is, just like Huemer, I want to use the same argumentative strategy and say, okay, well, what could justify that special right? Why is it okay if private property owners use this kind of coercion when it's not okay for this pushy cruise ship passenger to use coercion? Right? What makes it different about big landowners here versus the pushy person on the island? And what I want to do is I want to consider a few different possibilities, specifically ones that libertarians have defended, and argue that none of these justifications work. We can run through a few of these points. Specifically, I want to say there's three major possibilities I want to consider. The first is that some libertarians think that you're entitled to coerce people and coercively regulate your property after you transform and control some bit of property. Second, many libertarians think that you're justified exercising coercive control because other people are compensated for the coercion you employ. They actually benefit from the institution of private property, and as such, the coercion is justified. And finally, the thought is that maybe coercion is justified because it keeps people from exploiting your labor, from taking your work that you sort of poured into something and stealing it from you. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is I'm going to run through these different possibilities one at a time and argue that none of them work. With again then the presumptive conclusion being that actually the coercion involved with private property is not justified. Okay, so let's start with transformation and control. So this idea was proposed by a libertarian named Ed Feser, a philosopher. He used to be a libertarian, now he's kind of an arch-conservative as time has gone on. Things tend to go that way. So what he wants to propose first is he wants to say, yeah, why are you justified in coercing people with respect to some bit of, say you find some bit of uninhabited land, you claim it as your own, you build a farm on it. Why are you now justified in coercively excluding people from this farm? And he says, well, one possibility is that you've just transformed it. Right? And that's sort of, I think, an intuitive libertarian idea. Yeah, you take a thing, you sort of turn it into something else. Well, now you have the rights to it. But in my view, I don't think this is a plausible justification, because I don't think it's plausible that transformation justifies coercive control. So for example, suppose that there's a big natural forest that people like to walk through, they take a lot of hikes in it, and then you one day set it on fire and just blacken all the trunks of the trees. And now you say, look, I've transformed this forest. Now nobody else can walk through it. It's mine now, right? This is my forest, you have to stay out. I think it's implausible to think that you actually now have the right to coercively exclude people from this forest. I don't think anybody would think that's plausible. But that seems to show that mere transformation isn't enough to actually give you ownership over a thing, right? It seems like, yeah, just because you modify something doesn't by itself give you rights over it. It doesn't make it permissible to then coerce people with respect to this thing. So I think Fazer's argument is kind of odd here. So you might think, well, why does he think this? And he gives a little argument. He says, look, intuitively, it seems like transformation matters because it's at least more plausible that you own something after you've really radically transformed it than if you've just, say, modified it a little bit, which seems to show that maybe transformation matters morally, right? So, for example, suppose that you pour just a little bit of tomato juice into the ocean. You might think, well, now do you own the ocean? In some sense, you've transformed it a little bit, but seemingly none, right? But he says, well, now suppose that you actually dye the whole ocean bright green. Well, it still maybe doesn't seem like you own the ocean, but at least it seems more plausible. I don't know if people will buy this. I don't know how moved people are by this argument. This is what he thinks. He thinks, similarly, suppose that you transform the moon somehow. Well, maybe it seems more plausible that you own the moon than if you hadn't done anything to the moon. So that at least seems to show that transformation matters morally. If you have the intuition that transformation makes it more plausible that you own things, maybe transformation is enough to do this kind of moral work, to show that you can come to have the rights over something by transforming it. Yeah, but I don't think this is plausible because there's lots of cases where something becomes more plausible, but where that doesn't show that actually, there's been the relevant kind of transformation. Which, here, let me clarify what I mean by this. So, consider a case where I tell you I've memorized War and Peace, word for word. Okay, and now I tell you, and you say, well, really? And I say, well, yeah, I can tell you one thing to raise your credence in this. I've read through it once. Now, you might think, all right, well, is it plausible that I've memorized War and Peace because I've read through it once? Certainly not. But is it more plausible that I've memorized War and Peace after reading through it once than if I hadn't read it at all? Seemingly, yes, right? It's more plausible, but the fact that the fact that I've read it, the fact that I've read this book makes it more plausible that I've memorized it, right? That's not enough to show that I have memorized it, right? In the same way, I want to say, just because it's more plausible that transforming a resource means you own it, that doesn't mean that transforming it means you own it, right? The thought is, reading through a book one time, it's a necessary condition of having memorized it. It's something you have to do to memorize it, but it's not sufficient to memorize it. People see this distinction, right? It's not enough. And similarly, right, maybe transformation is necessary for owning something, but that doesn't show that it's enough to own something. Okay, so that's one case. Another case is I think sometimes this plausibility argument just doesn't work at all. So here's the thought. Suppose that somebody wants to claim that there is a ruler of Thailand, somebody who's entitled to rule over Thailand, like a king. There is, in fact, a king of Thailand. We might think it's more plausible that the king of Thailand is the person who's part of the official royal bloodline than, say, a farmer in Kansas in the United States. Right? It seems more plausible that the sort of official king of Thailand has the right to rule over Thailand than some random person from the United States. But does that show that the king of Thailand actually has the right to rule? Again, I don't think so, right? It doesn't seem like that's enough. So it seems like sometimes our intuitions about what makes things comparatively plausible are just baseless. So what I want to say is the same thing, the same thing is true of private property. Maybe it seems like in some cases transforming a resource makes it more plausible that you own something, but that's not enough. It's not enough to show that transformation makes it permissible for you to coercively control this thing. Okay. Second, Fazer thinks, okay, maybe transformation is enough, but what about if you control some resource? Right? That's something that often commonly goes along with ownership. You sort of set up some farm, you put fences around it, now people can't come on the farm. Well, is that enough for you to own the land? And again, Fazer thinks yes. He's like, yeah, establishing control is a plausible way of getting ownership of something. But again, I don't think this is the case. So for example, go back to the island case that we talked about with the cruise ship. That's a case where, say, somebody actually is exercising control over the island, right? They got on the island first, they're keeping other people off of it, they're successfully controlling the island. But it seems like that doesn't make their coercion permissible, right? It seems like, no, they're doing it, they're controlling the island, but the mere fact of control doesn't seem to render the control permissible. Related is that it seems like this is sort of an unacceptable, what you might call in philosophy, a de facto to de jure inference, which is some technical language, but in simple terms, basically the idea is, look, what are you trying to justify? The thing that you're trying to justify is coercive control over a resource. But what Fazer's proposing is, well, what justifies coercive control over the resource? The mere fact that you have coercive control over the resource. But it seems like that doesn't work, right? You can't justify something by just saying, yeah, I'm doing it, right? You can't justify, it's like, oh, I'm putting my hand on your face. We're like, hey, you can't do that. It's like, yeah, I'm doing it. But it seems sort of like that's what Fazer's saying, right? What justifies me coercively keeping you off of this bit of land? The fact that I'm successfully doing it. Well, that's not a very good argument, I don't think. Okay. Third is what I call the self-defeating objection, which is that, suppose that somebody, often libertarians want to defend private property because they think that they want to appeal to it when they're arguing against the wrongness of theft. Right? When they say, for example, the government taxes you, they say, if the government wrongs you when it taxes you, it's stealing your stuff. But in some sense, right, if the government is stealing your stuff, or if anybody's stealing your stuff, you don't control it, right? Which means that you don't actually have the rights over it on Fazer's account. So it seems like his account is self-defeating. If control is what you need to sort of own something, then anytime somebody takes something from you, that just shows you never owned it in the first place, because you didn't control it. Which again, is not the kind of thing that he's going to want. So I think there's a lot of problems with this. So again, I think, well, you might ask, well, why does Fazer think that control is enough? Why does control give you ownership rights? Why does that make coercing people permissible? And what he says is, well, control explains actually a lot of our intuitions about ourselves. So one thing that many libertarians think is that people have self-ownership rights. They think you have rights over your body that are very strong, that explain why people can't just come and take your kidney, why they can't just put their hand on your face without your consent, or use your body without your consent in other ways, right? And I think that's because we own ourselves in just the same way we own a bit of property. Which I actually think is a sort of intuitively attractive idea. But the thought is, and then Fazer wants to say, he says, well, why is it that we own ourselves, right? If we think it's intuitively plausible that we own ourselves and other people can't just use your body, why is that? And he says, well, it's because we control our body, right? That explains. So actually control is how you establish ownership. That's how you establish ownership of your body. You take control over it, you start moving it around, well, now you own it. And now other people can't just, take your kidneys. The problem with this is that I actually think that he's being a little slippery here when he talks about control. Because the kind of control you exercise over your body is very different from the kind of control you exercise over, say, a plot of land. Right? The kind of control you exercise over your body is an exercise of your will. Right? You think in your head kind of like, I want my arm to be in the air, and now it's in the air. Right? It's that kind of control that's very different from the kind of control over property where you think, I don't want people on this land, I'm going to keep them off by building a big fence. Right? I think these are just different things. So even if Fazer's right, and the reason that we own our bodies is because we sort of can move them around. We can't like move around our house in the same way. So I think that that's not a very good argument. Second, if you take this seriously, right, if you actually establish ownership over things, including bodies, by exercising control over them, then that creates what I call the matriarchy problem, based on some work by actually New Zealand's own Susan Muller-Oken. And she argues that basically, if that's the case, well, you don't come into the world controlling your body, right? When you're a little infant, you can't control your body at all. Instead, typically, your parent controls it. Typically, the mother first. Sort of, you emerge from the womb, you're in your mother's arms. She's moving you around. It seems like she's got control over you. But then it seems like, well, actually, maybe your mom owns you, right? You don't own yourself, right? You're your mother's property. And that is maybe attractive in certain ways, but maybe unattractive in other ways, right? If you're basically, your mother's property. So I don't think Fazer would actually want to endorse this upon reflection. So all this is to say, it seems like transformation and control aren't enough to give you private property rights. It's not enough to justify coercive control. We've seen a couple of arguments about why it might be, why someone might think this, but it seems like those arguments collapse under close scrutiny. So we should reject them. How are we doing on time? We've got like maybe another 10 minutes, 12 minutes? Okay, great. So we'll run through two other quick proposals. So why else might you think that private property is justified? Why else might coercive control of resources be justified? Well, a more popular argument is what you might call the compensation argument. This is endorsed famously by the philosopher Robert Nozick, who's a famous libertarian philosopher. And the basic idea is this. People are justified in coercively controlling property because when they do, that's to everyone's benefit, right? When you can have private property, that creates markets. Markets lead to the exchange of goods. Everybody gets richer. There's division of labor. People get wealthier. Capitalism develops. Maybe develops into socialism if you're sort of particularly with the Marxist persuasion. You think that happens, but you might think all these benefits flow from the establishment of private property, and that ultimately justifies the coercive control. We get a lot richer, and the fact that we get a lot richer justifies the fact that we exercise this kind of coercion with respect to one another. But it seems like this actually doesn't justify coercion for reasons that will now actually maybe be familiar. Well, actually, I'll give you, before we get to the familiar reasons, I'll give you a non-familiar reason. Here's another case. Sorry, there's lots of cases, because this is kind of how Huemer argues in his book, so I adopt it from him. He likes to use these intuitive thought experiments. Hopefully it's not tedious. But we'll give you one more. So imagine you're stranded on an island with another person. And you're both eking out an existence. You're eating all the peanuts, they're eating the fish. You're both living fairly equal lives, it's fine. One day, a lifeboat washes up on shore. You're like, oh, this is cool. But then the person you're on the island with says, you know what, I'm taking it, it's mine. And they run over and they knock you over, push you onto the ground, tie you up, and then they jump in the lifeboat and take off. And you say, hey, what are you doing? And they say, well, look, I'm actually leaving you better off. Because now you get the whole island to yourself, right? Before we had to split all the resources on the island. But now you get them all to yourself. Your quality of life will be twice as good. So I'm actually benefiting you by tying you up. You're welcome. Okay, so in this story, right, what you have is you have somebody trying to justify coercion to you, right? They've coerced you, they've tied you up. And the way they try to justify it to you is by appealing to the fact that they're benefiting you. You're compensated, right? Like, yes, you were pushed down, now you have to squirm out of the ropes. It's annoying, they hurt us a little bit. But on the whole, your life will be better because they did this. But you might think that doesn't seem to actually justify what they did, right? I think intuitively it seems like they still acted impermissibly. So it seems like the mere fact that they leave you better off isn't enough to justify them coercively seizing control over this lifeboat, this resource. Or so I think, right? So that's one thing I want to argue. Additionally, right, we can use Huemer's own examples that we talked about earlier in the talk, right? Huemer gives us a bunch of cases where he himself argues that the mere fact that you benefit somebody, even maybe providing them with significant benefit, doesn't justify coercing them, right? So, knocking potato chips out of your hands or threatening to stab you because you're eating potato chips might leave you better off in the long run. But the fact that it actually benefits you doesn't seem to justify the coercion involved. So in that case, it seems like, again, the same thing is going to be true of private property, right? Even if libertarians are right, all the libertarian economists are correct, that markets make us richer and actually benefit everybody, that still doesn't actually justify coercion, even if true. Done the page. Okay, so much for compensation. We'll consider one final argument. And this is an argument proposed by a libertarian philosopher named Eric Mack. And again, he says, what might justify coercively controlling resources? And he says, well, here's a sort of intuition. Suppose that you spend all this time working on building a car. Or no, let's say, we'll come back to the car. So let's say you spend all this time building a house. You invest all this effort into it, and then somebody one day comes up and moves in, right? Just arbitrarily. They say, oh, this is great. Thanks for building this house. I'm going to live here now. You might think, you know what, this person kind of took my labor from me, right? I poured all this labor into constructing this thing, and now they've kind of just taken it, right? Or suppose it's a movable object, you can carve a chair, and somebody just carries it off. Right? He thinks you're expropriating people's labor, and it seems like there's something objectionable about that. where it actually, you might think, well, maybe you're justified in coercing people to keep them from taking your labor. If you pour a bunch of labor, invest it in something, well, now that's what justifies coercion. So when you find some, say, a bit of unused land and you till the soil and you turn it into a farm, you're now justified in excluding people from it. That's Max ideas. Maybe intuitive. But then again, I still don't think this kind of justification works. And I'll give you a couple of cases to show why. Again, suppose that you take the wildfire case from earlier and make it labor intensive. So now there's a big, unowned forest out in the hills. People like to hike through it. I go and I set it on fire. But I put a ton of effort, right? Every tree I have to laboriously set on fire on its own, right? The fire just doesn't spread. I have to build a whole thing, involve a bunch of newspaper. It takes me weeks and weeks. And I say, okay, I've now transformed this, and I've poured a ton of my labor into this. So now I'm justified in saying you can't use this forest anymore, sorry. I don't think that's intuitive, right? It doesn't seem like I'm justified in coercively keeping you from using this forest after just because I've poured a bunch of labor into this. I think there's a deeper reason for this that we can get into in this case, right? So suppose that I own a car, grant me moral ownership of it, and I say to you, you can use, I'll tell you what, I'll let you paint my car, right? You're an artist. I say, you can paint it. You say, great, thanks so much. You spend a bunch of time painting elaborate murals. I say, great, looks amazing. And then I hop in the car to go drive to work. You say, wait, you can't do that. This is my car now. I say, why? And you're like, look, I poured all this labor into it, right? And if you drive off with it, you're driving off with my labor. You're enslaving me. You're stealing my labor. I think this claim doesn't seem plausible, right? Why doesn't it seem plausible? Well, because you kind of knew going in, painting the car, that I might drive off with it, right? I have the right to drive off with the car. You know that. You anyway paint on the car, and now I drive off with it. It seems like you have no basis for complaint. But in the same way, I think the same thing is true of, say, unowned natural resources, right? So suppose, if a resource is unowned, we all have the right to use it. Now, if you go and invest a bunch of labor and turn it into your little farm, you sort of do so knowing that other people are permitted to use it. So then it seems like you can't then complain if people come and sort of using the thing, right? You can't be like, hey, you're taking my labor. It's like, well, yeah, but you knew that going in. You have no basis for complaint. I'm just doing what I've always been permitted to do. So again, I don't think that this argument works. Okay, sorry, we've just dashed through a lot of arguments, hopefully not too quickly, but happy to sort of go back to clarify anything in the question and answer if people would like, or field objections or whatever. But the big conclusion that I want to argue for is I want to say, just like Huemer's, Huemer argues, you consider all these different possibilities about why the state might be justified in coercing people. None of them work, so it seems like we should conclude the state is not justified in coercing people. I say, sure. And now we've also considered all these different reasons for thinking that coercing people with respect to natural resources is justified, and shown that none of those work either. So it seems like we should conclude the same thing. At least presumptively, we should think that nobody is justified in exercising the kind of coercive control of property that we associate with property rights. Which is to say, you should be a thoroughgoing anarchist. You should reject the authority of the state, and you should also reject that people have moral private property rights of the kinds that libertarians favor. But then there's a question. If that's right, where does that leave us morally speaking? And I think there's two paths you could go here. The first is what I call radical pacifist anarchism. And the thought is, it just turns out that nothing justifies the coercive control of resources. You're not justified ever in using violence or threats to keep people from using a particular thing. That might make life awkward in some ways, and inconvenient in certain ways, but sometimes morality is tough. And that we just have to treat each other morally, which means we have to come to agreements, right? If you want somebody not to use something, some house, some car, some bit of land, you have to convince them not to. You have to get them to agree. You can't just force them to do it. That might be time consuming. Maybe there's ways to handle this, right? Maybe you can start trying to build tools like big consensus-seeking organizations that try to coordinate people and get people to sign on to cooperatively use resources. But that's what you have to do. You can't just coercively use things. Okay, so that's one possibility. Alternatively, I think you could go a route that I would call egalitarian anarchism. And the idea here is that actually there are certain cases where coercion is justified with respect to controlling resources, but only in very narrow situations, specifically situations where if you're an egalitarian and you care about equality, you might think that coercion is justified. So I'll give you one final case. Suppose, let's go back to our castaways on the island. They're splitting the island's goods. One of them eats the peanuts, one of them eats the fish. And it turns out there's a good reason for this, because the one who eats the fish actually can't eat the peanuts. They're allergic. And the one who eats the peanuts can't catch fish. They're not coordinated enough. Now suppose one day the person with a peanut allergy starts just clearing out all the peanut plants because they want to make a cricket field. So they're just destroying all of this person's food source. And the sort of uncoordinated person comes and says, stop, what are you doing? I need this to survive. Like, this is what I eat. If you destroy all these peanut plants, I'm going to just live a meager, miserable existence while you're sort of living comfortably, eating all your fish, and sort of living high, right? You get to play cricket, you get to eat fish, I have nothing. And the person says, well, I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. I want to play cricket. Now I think the question is, would the uncoordinated castaway be permitted to coercively keep the person from destroying her food source, from destroying these peanut pockets? I think intuitively, if you're inclined to say yes, right, that actually shows that maybe sometimes it is justified to coerce people, but only in very narrow circumstances, right? Specifically, only in circumstances where doing so is necessary to preserve an equal relationship, right? These two people, like these castaways, they're living equal lives. Now, what if they wants to upset that? Make her life much better and make the other's life much worse by destroying these, these plants? I think it actually might be in that case permissible to say, no, you can't do that, and I will use force against you and sort of restrain you or tie you up, or if you try to destroy these plants. So if you have that intuition, then I think you can say there's sometimes coercion is permissible, and then you end up with this position that I call egalitarian anarchism. But I could see people having intuitions going either way, right? So you might say, maybe that's just tough, right? This person's acting badly. You can criticize them. You can say, stop that, please. But you still can't coercively keep them from destroying those resources. So I think there's two ways to go. I'm a little bit more attracted to egalitarian anarchism, but other people's views might differ. But I think that's where we might end up in a world where we say people don't have the kind of moral private property rights that libertarians typically favor. Okay, that's the argument. That's the libertarian argument against private property. Again, we've moved through a lot. I tried to pack a lot into the quick talk, but hopefully that was interesting, and happy to look forward to your questions and comments and objections and whatever. Yeah, thanks.
Perfect. We'll just take a quick 5-minute break or so, but first a round of applause for our speakers. And we'll say get back to questions at 7:26 or so. And open the floor for questions now. Probably call about 15 minutes.
Concerns and objections also welcome.
I just had a question about your argument against appropriation.
Yeah.
So, in the cases you gave, particularly the one in terms of painting the car, was there not already? So the argument was just that labour is not a justification in and of itself. But in those cases that you gave, there was already an agreement of ownership prior to that.
Yeah, great question. So yes, you might think there's maybe a disanalogy, right? Where look, in the car case, you own the car, and so you already have sort of the right to use it. But in the sort of cases libertarians are interested in, right? They're interested in unowned things, right? They're interested in big unowned fields, forests, resources, coal, whatever. So you might think this is an important difference, but I think the key is to actually, when you think about property, right? The way to think about property, I think, is that you should think of it as actually a bundle of different rights, right? So what does it mean to own something, to fully own a thing? Well, one thing that it means to own it is you have rights against other people using the thing, right? So you may call this claim rights. You have a claim against other people using the thing. But you also have permissions to use the thing, right? It's yours. You can do what you want, right? So they can't just use things. They can't use it. You can. And then you have various other rights as well. The power to transfer ownership to other people. Those are sort of the main ones. There's some others, but you might think it's all these different rights. But now when we think about unowned things, strictly speaking, you actually have a kind of ownership right over unowned things, in that you have the permission to use it, right? You don't wrong anybody else when you use an unowned thing. In just the same way that when you own a thing, you don't wrong anybody when you use it, right? So what I want to say is the key right for my thought experiment is just the fact that you, when you own a car, you have the right to use it, right? You have the right to drive off with it if you like. That's part of your ownership. What you do when you give somebody permission to paint the car is you say, I'm waiving my claim against you using it, right? Before it was wrong for you to use the car. I now give you permission, so now you can do, you can paint the car. You can use it in this particular way, right? So you have basically the thought is, you have a permission and a claim. That means that they don't have a permission. You get rid of your claim, now they have a permission. You both have permissions. They can paint the car, you can drive off with it. Similarly, when things are unowned, right, the thought is, well, just nobody has claims over it. But that means that everybody has permissions, right? If a field is unowned, that means you can use it. So can somebody else. In the same way, suppose that, a car just falls from heaven, right? It's unowned. Well, the thought would be everybody can use it, right? Nobody has rights over it, nobody owns it, so everybody has permissions to use it. So if you now say you go over and you start painting the car, and then I hop into it, you might say, hey, you're taking it. I'm like, yeah, but I had a permission to use this, in just the same way that an owner of a car has a permission to use it. So I actually think that the two cases, even though one is a case of ownership and one's a case of non-ownership, they're actually, I think, relevantly analogous, right? They're similar in the key respect, which is that in both cases, the key feature, I think, is that the person who drives off with the thing, who takes the thing, they had a permission to do that before you ever started working on it, and you knew that. So I think that that's going to be, so I think your worry is a very good one, and I think that's a move that people will make, but then I think that's the reply. So you say, no, but yeah, it's true, you own the car, you don't own the field, but in both cases, the person who takes the thing is permitted to take it. And you knew that before you ever labored on it. So you can't complain when they sort of walk off with your labor. Yeah, thanks, great question.
Sam.
I wonder if you could explain why you think that libertarianism is a philosophical problem. Because in my experience of libertarians, it's largely men having a midlife crisis, or it's people that are very attracted to a shallow ideology that makes them feel superior, or both. And the only time it's a political problem is when it's rich people who are using it as a weapon against the left, and it doesn't have to have any coherence or philosophical basis, and it can be completely contradictory and internally inconsistent, but it's just a bunch of slogans to chuck at the left and try. So I can't see the value in treating it as a philosophical problem.
Great, thanks. That's a great question. So there's a bunch to say about this. I'd say a few things. One is that I think one attractive thing about building arguments against libertarianism and taking it seriously is just because I think that in some sense it's still some of the best arguments against sort of egalitarian socialist, democratic socialist positions, right? Anybody who, if you like redistribution, probably I think some of the best arguments against it are probably going to be libertarian arguments. So if you're going to argue against anyone, you may as well argue against libertarians. So that's one thing that I would say. Second is that I do think that libertarians have done a lot to develop their philosophical position. There are a lot of them, and they have a surprising number of sort of adherents. And I think often, even if you're just arguing with people who say aren't necessarily like ideological libertarians, maybe haven't thought too much about the idea of, about this sort of question before, I think you'll often hear arguments a lot like this, right? People say, well, you can't just take my stuff. Like, I don't know, don't I have the right to my property? Hey, I built this, I worked on this, I made this. You'll hear these kinds of things. So I think it's worthwhile developing philosophical responses to them, both to deal with the sophisticated libertarians insofar as you take them seriously, and even if you don't take them particularly seriously, at the end of the day, I think there is still a movement of people out there who think this, and the people who at least have these kinds of thoughts are actually much more numerous than the dyed-in-the-wool libertarians. Many people will not call themselves libertarians, but you might be arguing with an uncle, and you'll start to hear things that sound libertarian-ish in character. So the ideas are at least powerful enough that they emerge again and again organically out of many different people. So I think it's worth engaging with those. A third reason is that I do think that they're actually, for instance, I'm an anarchist, right? I actually do think there are some things that libertarians are kind of right about and that are attractive. So I am attracted to Huemer's argument against state authority. Right? Many people will not be, many socialists will not be, but there are at least some libertarian things that I think, I'm like, yeah, it doesn't seem like the state can just tell you what to do and you have to obey it. Or you might, I think, I'm sort of attracted to the idea, maybe it does seem like we own ourselves and have control over our bodies and rights over our bodies. So, insofar as you have any of those intuitions, then I think it's worth grappling with libertarianism. And then finally, I think you'd be surprised at the extent to which socialists engage with libertarians and actually find themselves a little disturbed. So, for example, there's a sort of famous socialist philosopher named G.A. Cohen, who was sort of a very sort of standard classic Canadian Marxist, spent a lot of time trying to reconstruct Marxist theory of history in a rigorous sort of analytic way. And then he encountered the writings of Robert Nozick, who sort of made a brief appearance in the talk, the libertarian philosopher, and all of a sudden he was deeply troubled. And he describes it woke me from my dogmatic slumbers. And part of the reason that he thought this is because he thinks that actually there's some features of libertarianism that are actually maybe a little bit closer to socialist positions than we might expect or want to admit. Particularly certain species of Marxism. So for example, one idea that many Marxists are very attracted to is something kind of like the idea of expropriation of labor. Right? The idea is, yeah, I own my labor and myself. I pour it into my work, and then it's taken from me. But the people taking it, it's not the state redistributing, it's the capitalists, right? They're taking my labor, they're forcing me to work in their factories and stealing my self-ownership from me, right? I own myself, I have the right to my products, and now you're taking this from me. You can't do that, capitalist. But in a way, right, that sounds a little bit libertarian in character. So, I think there actually maybe is something worth, for socialists, and particularly Marxists, sort of to take seriously libertarian views, to really think, what exactly is the difference between my view and their view? What are they maybe getting right? What are they getting wrong? Why are they getting it wrong? Okay, so that would be my fourfold response to your question, but it's a very good one. Maybe satisfying, we'll see.
Just thinking about the definition of, coercion from a kind of anthropological view. It's quite narrow, groups, particularly physical body autonomy, which I think in some ways there's kind of a bit of an underlying, emotional effect to go, oh, someone's going to stop me from doing something with my body. But from a kind of historical, cultural view, a lot of the social control is around kind of excommunication, exile, basically the withdrawal of your kind of participation in society. Would including that definition to a wider definition of coercion change your argument in any way?
Yeah, great. It's a good question. So I'll say a couple of things. So one reason that I think Huemer starts with this notion, and then I kind of just borrow from, the reason Huemer starts with this notion is because, in some sense, when you're building a philosophical argument, right, you want to reach the strongest conclusion possible from the weakest conclusions possible, right? So you want to start from the least controversial assumptions to prove your argument, the things that most people will agree with. So what Huemer wants to do is, so I think what Huemer would say is he'd say, yes, maybe there are more expansive notions of coercion, but I wanted to start with a very conservative notion that pretty much everybody will agree, right? Everybody will agree that, oh yeah, just attacking people seems intuitively wrong. People might disagree potentially about whether, say, with just withdrawing care or withdrawing assistance is of the same kind. So I think he wants to say, there might be room for disagreement. I can make my point just by focusing on this sort of less controversial view, so let's start with that. And I can still show then that, the state is just basically a gang of people who don't have any special rights. And then I kind of try to do the same thing. I say, all right, let's just start with his view, right? Because I'm sort of arguing against him. Let's take his view seriously. So there's sort of an argumentative strategy there that leads to taking this weaker notion. Say you take a stronger notion, you say, yeah, maybe coercion is more expansive. I'm certainly open to that idea. I probably lean away from it for various philosophical reasons, but I don't think it's implausible. How would that change the argument? It might change a little bit, right? That might place sort of even additional constraints upon you, right? So you might think, not only, right, am I bound to sort of not coerce people with respect to natural resources, sort of using physical aggression, but also maybe I can't coerce people by just withdrawing assistance from them. Right? Say I happen to have some medical skills. I can't threaten to sort of not treat people in emergencies if they don't do it.
I'm just had a thought of like, so for example, the recent banks withdrawing loans from mining on particular lands and saying to miners, sorry, we won't support you, you are out of the system.
Yeah, okay, well, so that's an interesting case. So one thing I would say is that, interestingly, like, I think that case shows that even if you operate with a very narrow notion of coercion, actually a lot more things fall under that narrow umbrella than you might think, especially given my argument, right? Because you might think, look, say you're a bank and you withdraw funds. Well, in some sense, you might think of that as just a refusal to provide aid, but you might also think of that as actually coercion in the narrower sense, because in some sense, well, the bank has all these assets, right? And when they're withdrawing funds, in some sense what they're doing is they're kind of taking away your tickets to access those assets, right? In some sense you might think of, like, so again, this is an argument that G.A. Cohen makes that I referenced earlier. You know, he says, you know, we should think about money in a way as freedom, right? Money is sort of, they're like little tickets that let you do things. And if you don't have the money, people don't let you in they don't let you in the spaces. They coercively exclude you from the spaces, right? Oh, sorry, you can't come into the theme park. You don't have the money. You're locked out. So in some sense, I actually think withdrawing money from people is actually coercion in the narrow sense. It is actually restricting their freedom via aggressive coercive action. So you actually don't need a more expansive notion of coercion to make sense of a lot of these cases. There are some cases where coercion actually will sort of take the form of withdrawing aid, but in many cases actually in our society, because of the sort of prevalence of private property, often when you're withdrawing sort of financial assistance from somebody, really what you're doing is you're narrowing their sphere of permissible action, smaller and smaller and smaller, which I think is just straightforward coercion in the narrow sense.
Do you have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, I have to say sorry for my poor spoken English. First of all, Professor, just talk about the Iceland case you just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I think in history, some factory expands the Iceland case you're talking about. You say, for example, one man step up, land on the Iceland and claim that the Iceland is belong to me.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it happened in the history. For example, 400 years ago, I'm in Britain people that are North American, if they plant on a land, this part of land belongs to him. At least it's reasonable to all the other Britain peoples because they follow the same law of Britain law.
Yeah.
It's recognized. So I think the coercion, we so-called ownership coercion. Sometimes, if it depends on some law, and we can treat law as a contract. If the coercion it depends on some recognition and the free contract, I think it's reasonable. It's reasonable, not necessarily justified, but it's reasonable.
Okay, great. So I think there's a few different strands there that let me sort of parse apart. So, right, so one point you make is, yeah, actually people claim islands, they have claimed islands, and people have sort of treated that as legitimate, right? Early colonists, Britain shows up in a boat, they plant their flag, they say this is, now possession of the Queen or the King, congratulations. And yeah, intuitively people are like, yeah, that's fine. But in some sense, what I want to suggest in this talk, and I sort of want to drop on Huemer, is that that intuition is sort of a mistake, right? So in some sense, both Huemer and I, we recognize that we're arguing against a portion of common sense wisdom, right? People do take private property to be totally natural, fine, normal, morally unproblematic. Similarly, people take state coercion to be totally unproblematic in general. But then the challenge is to say, well, actually, maybe that's just because we're a little mystified by the fact that the king wears a big crown and everybody kind of gets dazzled, right? Or we just sort of take it as natural because this is how we've done things. But if we think about it critically, then actually it seems like we have to give up these intuitions, right? So it might seem normal that we might think, yeah, the sort of Great Britain claimed this island. But then the thought is, well, look, if you can't just claim an island when you get off a cruise ship, why is it that the first sort of settlers were able to claim that island, right? What made them so special? And then I think the thought is, it doesn't seem like there's actually an answer to that question. So maybe we're just wrong about the settlers, right? That's kind of what I want to suggest, and also what Huemer wants to suggest, right? So we want to say, yeah, people have claimed islands, we've taken it as natural, but we were actually making a mistake. And we can see that when we critically reflect upon more sort of common sense cases about our everyday interactions that aren't so mystified and draped in kind of the trappings of, crowns and flags, etc. Okay, second part is he suggests, well, what about the idea of a contract, right? Maybe a contract would justify coercion. And I actually think that's plausible. I think it's very plausible to think if you freely agree to, you commit to not using some resource, now the person would actually be justified in holding you to that contract, right? You say, sign a contract saying, I promise to stay off your land. Yeah, I think then now, if you then start to march on their land, they can keep you off and you don't really have a basis for complaint. So what I would then suggest is, if that's the case, there actually is a pathway to forming private property, right? If people actually consented to the formation of private property via contract or agreement, then you would actually own the property. You would have the right to coerce them. But it's just in practice, like nobody ever did that, right? I imagine nobody here was like, yes, I agree to you owning this home, like I agree to you owning this field. So contracts are plausible, but there actually has to be a contract. And if we look at the history of, property formation or state formation, there never actually was that kind of agreement between the person who claims to own the thing and the excluded parties. So that's what I want to say.
I think everyone can sign a contract. We call it law or constitution.
Yeah. So in a way, that's kind of the radical pacifist anarchist proposal I put together, right? We might think maybe we have really good reason to want to give people some rights over things, right? We might want like you to be the farmer and you to be the metalsmith and you to be whatever. And we might say, okay, so let's give you the iron, let's give you the field, etc. We might have very good reason to want to give you that sort of domain of control, but the thought is we need to agree to that. You can't just take it unilaterally. And so that would be the kind of radical pacifist anarchist view. It's like, yeah, you can get control of resources, but everybody has to sign off on it. If we can all agree to using the resource, that's amazing. That's what moral sort of management of resources looks like. But that just means that we have to do the legwork of actually getting the sign off of the people who you would otherwise like to exclude from your resource. Yeah, great questions. Thanks.
Perfect. Yeah. So I think we'll have to end it there.
I'm happy to stick around and chat with you if you want to press objections or ask questions. I'll hang out. I don't have anywhere to be.
So I'll remind people about the sign-up sheet for the email list if you're interested in future events. I'll ask for another round of applause for Jesse.
Thanks for your questions. I really appreciate it.
And let's not forget a round of applause for our last staff too.